we've seen a lack of general compliance, knowledge of MoCRA, and there are still literally thousands of companies that are not yet in compliance with the pretty basic parts of MoCRA.
Hello, and welcome to episode 4 of FDA Watch. I'm Wayne Pines. I've been involved with FDA for many decades. I was Associate Commissioner of the agency at one point, and I've authored or edited 16 books about the agency.
And I'm Shelly Garg, and I'm the managing partner and founder of Garg Law, a full-service FDA-focused law firm. I have been on the private side advising companies on regulatory compliance and enforcement for the last 15 years.
So hopefully you've already subscribed to the podcast and have listened to the first 2 episodes. The first one focused on pharma, the second one on medical devices. Episode 3 focused on food issues. If you haven't had an opportunity to subscribe and listen to these terrific episodes, just visit our website, fdawatch.net. That's fdawatch.net, or go to wherever you get your podcasts. Here's what to expect from FDA Watch. We'll have at least 2 episodes a month. We're independent, nonpartisan. We'll be a national forum for discussing the latest developments, trends, and issues in 4 core areas: pharmaceuticals and biologics, medical devices and diagnostics, food and dietary supplements, and cosmetics and personal care products.
Thanks, Wayne. And of course, we'll be discussing the overall direction of the agency, including what to expect from the new administration and what's going on with AI at the agency. If you subscribe, you'll also get bonus episodes when there's breaking news. And as we've seen at the kick of the year, there's quite a bit of breaking news already, right, Wayne?
Absolutely. This is one of the most interesting times for FDA because of the transition. In this episode, we're going to focus on cosmetic issues. We have 2 more fabulous guests to help us discuss them. You'll meet them in just a moment.
But first, let's get to some headlines.
First headline is from the Pharma desk. COVID is going to be an issue for this incoming administration, and Dr. Califf, the former commissioner, reflected on COVID-19 in an article published on FDA Voice. It was called Vaccines for COVID-19, a Personal Reflection by Robert Califf. It discusses the status of the COVID vaccines, which the commissioner says constitutes one of the most important elements of government policy, particularly as it relates to the FDA and his term as commissioner. COVID is certainly going to be an issue with this administration. We have seen some of the directives under the Biden administration already overturned by the new administration. So Dr. Califf's personal reflections are certainly worth looking at. From the device desk, AdvaMed, the MedTech Association, commended the House of Representatives' bipartisan task force on artificial intelligence for urging CMS, the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Service, to develop a formalized payment pathway for AI-enabled medical devices. These are medical devices that are FDA cleared, and they provide clinical information to aid in patient diagnosis or treatment. The task force highlighted AI-enabled medical devices, stating, and I quote, "Considering that AI tools streamline these practices and reduce time spent on services, current payment mechanisms cannot adequately reimburse these tools. AI will be a big challenge for the incoming administration, as it would have been for any administration because of the prevalence now of AI." Shelly?
Thanks, Wayne. From the foods desk, there's a lot happening in the food space, including a significant development involving FDA's revocation of the authorization for the use of Red 3 based on the Delaney Clause of the Federal Food Drug Cosmetic Act. The FDA is amending its color additive regulations to no longer allow for the use of FD&C Red 3 in food and ingested drugs in response to a 2022 color additive petition. The Delaney Clause, enacted in 1960 as part of the Color Additives Amendment to the FDCA, prohibits FDA authorization of a food additive or color additive if it has been found to induce cancer in humans or animals. Red 3 has been primarily used in certain food products such as candies, cakes, cupcakes, cookies, frozen desserts, frostings, and icings, as well as certain ingested drugs. Manufacturers who use Red 3 in food and ingested drugs will have until January 2027 or January 2028, respectively, to reformulate their products. While other countries still currently allow for certain uses of Red 3, foods imported to the U.S. must comply with these new requirements.
Let me just make one note on that. One of the first actions I was involved in when I was at FDA was the ban on red number 2. And I remember the public reaction because red number 2 at the time was used in red M&Ms. And you would be shocked to know how many hundreds of thousands of Americans were concerned about red M&Ms.
Yep. From the cosmetics desk, PCPC, at a recent webinar focusing on sustainability sponsored by the Personal Care Products Council, presenters said that by leveraging biological processes to create raw materials, biotech enables industries to transition from extractive methods to innovative solutions that are efficient and environmentally friendly. For example, the speakers in this sustainability webinar noted that biotech generated ingredients can open doors to previously inaccessible materials, reducing environmental impact through smaller production footprints and less resource intensive processes. So it's something to check out. Now, Wayne, let's meet our guests.
Joining us today is Will Woodlee. He's managing partner at the DC law firm of Kleinfeld, Kaplan, and Becker, an old line, well-established, well-known law firm that specializes in FDA issues. And Will has a broad practice in the food, drug, and cosmetic fields. Welcome to FDA Watch, Will.
Thank you so much, Wayne and Shelly. It's an absolute pleasure and privilege to be here.
Thanks, Will. Also joining us today is David Lennarz. David is the president at Registrar Corp. He manages the company's overseas operations and has worked for almost 22 years in FDA regulated industries in the US and Europe. Welcome to FDA Watch, David.
Thanks very much. Pleasure to be here as well.
Well, there's a lot to discuss when it comes to cosmetic issues. Let's begin with a threshold question. We anticipate that Dr. Marty Makary from Johns Hopkins will be the next FDA commissioner. President Trump has announced that he will be nominated. Let me ask both of our guests, beginning with Will, what should be his top priority when it comes to cosmetics regulation?
Thanks, Wayne. There remains much work to be done to fully implement the MoCRA amendments to the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. Some of those action items from FDA required by the law have statutory deadlines that have passed or that remain on the horizon, but not too far away. And so ensuring that the agency meets its legal obligations under the law to issue these regulations as required by MoCRA seems to me to be a significant and important priority, in part because we've seen in other areas of FDA regulation that advocacy groups in particular will sue the agency under the Administrative Procedure Act for failing to make these deadlines, and that causes further delay and requires diversion of resources to defend those lawsuits. And what ultimately happens in most of these cases is a negotiated settlement for a schedule for meeting these deadlines. So at least from my perspective, the new commissioner will need to make sure that amid everything else going on with the administration transition, the agency has its eye on these deadlines and is applying the appropriate resources to ensure that the agency meets them.
David, same question. Dr. Makary is going to be coming in. If you had his ear, what would you tell him the top priority would be for cosmetics regulation?
Well, certainly agree with Will. There are obviously rules that still need to be finalized and pushed out. I'd say, secondly, certainly we've seen a lack of general compliance, knowledge of MoCRA, and we've done some research through FOIA requests and other means to determine that there are still literally thousands of companies that are not yet in compliance with the pretty basic parts of MoCRA. So I'd say, in addition to getting out the other areas, final rules, I'd say, starting to better educate the cosmetics, personal care industry, and then, frankly, at some point there needs to be some enforcement kicking in.
Thanks, David. And I'm curious to get your thoughts on this. I mean, I think MoCRA is, obviously modernizes an 80-year-old regulatory framework for cosmetics. Um, I'd like to understand what your thoughts are on why you think MoCRA is a game changer and its current and anticipated impact on businesses, consumers, and industry. And then you touched on this just now is realistically, um, how do we anticipate that it will be enforced given sort of a delayed rollout, issues with staffing, et cetera?
Yeah, so game changer for sure. Remember, VCRP existed for years,
Hmm.
but frankly, there weren't that many participants in it. Why, which is understandable. Plenty of companies did not want to voluntarily tell FDA, the ingredients in their products, as an example.
Hmm.
So obviously, MoCRA now, it's a game changer in that there is a statutory requirement around registration, around product listings, a change in labeling, and an adverse event reporting requirement. So, kind of moving it from that corporate side onto, how is it also a real game changer, is frankly, it really should be a game changer for consumers. Ultimately, this is all about protecting consumers around products that could harm them. And so I think that's the real value to MoCRA. Needless to say, players in the industry, large companies in particular, were in favor of MoCRA, as were the major trade associations, PCPC, IBA, to essentially, have a level playing field with a well-defined, legal framework. So I think overall, it's a very positive thing. But I'm sure we'll get to kind of where it is today and where
Yeah.
it's sort of we're seeing some of the failures.
Yeah, Will, let me ask the same question, but particularly emphasize what is the impact of MoCRA likely to be on companies, on industry?
Thanks, Wayne. I think the short answer is quite varied. Um, a number of these requirements, put into law and provide enforceability for practices that many companies already undertook voluntarily, whether it's pursuant to the voluntary registration program or otherwise. And so, as David mentioned earlier, this may not prove to be a significant lift in many respects for big companies that already operate in other more heavily regulated FDA areas. But it's completely novel to many smaller companies, and as David mentioned, there remains to be a lot of education, both in terms of the existence of these requirements, as well as how to comply and how to obtain the resources to comply, because some of these entities may not have within-house adequate scientific or regulatory service providers, and will need to look without their organizations to ensure that they're meeting all their obligations as these requirements come into effect and begin to be enforced by the agency.
Do you see a difference between the impact on the larger companies versus the smaller businesses in the cosmetics area in terms of registering and listing products? Let me ask Will that, and then maybe turn to David on that. Will?
I do. Some of the larger companies that play in multiple pools may already have familiarity with similar registration and product listing regimes that apply, for example, to drug products, or facility registration requirements that apply to food facilities, or CGMP regimes that apply to drugs, or to devices, or to foods or dietary supplements. And so those companies that have experience with those standalone but related regimes for other products with which they may in which they may deal, they'll have a leg up, as opposed to smaller companies that have only operated under the legacy regulatory requirements for cosmetics. And while the law does have some small business exemptions, they're pretty limited in terms of the dollar amounts that trigger those exemptions. And so only the very smallest companies will enjoy the regulatory holiday they provide.
Thanks, Will. And David, I mean, what do you think are best practices for complying, both for smaller businesses and larger businesses that are familiar, given that it is a mandatory requirement, for example, with respect to registration and listing, but so far we have not seen enforcement activity, which, it may be delayed. Obviously, FDA is always resource constrained, but just what are your thoughts on best practices for complying for both categories?
Well, I think, honestly, at least what we're seeing is the push to comply today is still largely driven by retailers who are selling these products. They are actually the ones that are, pushing their suppliers, and I'm speaking specifically around foreign manufacturers, foreign brand owners. If you're a large retailer, you want to make sure that your suppliers are meeting the compliance requirements. So, in the absence of FDA actually doing any enforcement at this stage, it's really largely driven by retailers. But of course, products also flow to not just retailers into the US, but just to importers and distributors who are not going to have the vigilance necessarily around their supply chain as certainly as strongly as a larger retailer like a Walmart or a Kroger or a TJ Maxx kind of business. So it's being driven by retailers. I think the biggest flaw in the system currently, aside from FDA, not educating and not enforcing, is all other FDA regulated products arriving into our 300 plus ports of entry require a registration and listing number to be entered into the ACE system for customs clearance. Cosmetics does not. There is no field, literally, in the ACE system for a customs broker to say, okay, you're in China producing this cosmetic product, you're the manufacturer, what's your registration number? What are your product listing numbers? Though that doesn't exist. So, in absence of that, there essentially is no way for the agency to have a clue of what's coming in, at least unless they dig into their data post entry, months later to see, kind of product flow. So that's the biggest issue right there as far as enforcement goes.
I'd like to shift gears a bit, talk about safety. Obviously, that's the bottom line with cosmetics. Start with David again. What constitutes, in your view, adequate safety substantiation under MoCRA? What are the challenges in developing safety packages for legacy or proprietary formulations?
Yeah, so, I think, again, like Will had said earlier, the large players out there, they're in many cases, if they're outside the US, they're perhaps in Europe, they're already complying with, much stricter safety substantiation requirements, right? I think the challenge are the smaller manufacturers, the smaller brand owners, of which there are thousands, literally thousands, um, for them to even understand, what are the safety, how can I meet the safety substantiation requirements? Interestingly, MoCRA's requirements around safety substantiation, frankly, are don't have a ton of teeth in them, of course, until an enforcement action happens. In the sense that it's sufficient evidence of safety substantiation. Okay, tests, studies, scientific means, and you hold on to this information. So if FDA comes knocking, so I think the large companies, they largely have this down. They're doing it for the EU, other highly regulated markets. It's the mid and small size manufacturers and brand owners that they don't have these sort of processes in place to understand how to deal with this. So I think there'll be a lot of education and work around that piece of it. And again, we'll see as FDA starts to enforce eventually how many people, what is the failure rate kind of around this.
Will, any views on that?
Absolutely. Well, it's interesting because, since 1975, FDA regulations have required that manufacturers have adequate safety substantiation for ingredients used in cosmetic products, and MoCRA layered on top of this statutory requirements that sound, from their words, somewhat similar to safety standards that we see in other places in the Food and Drug and Cosmetic Act, but have their own nuances, just like with a lot of these other requirements. Not exactly the same serious adverse event reporting triggers for cosmetics under MoCRA as we see for example, OTC drugs and dietary supplements. And so we'll have to wait to see, as David mentioned, when enforcement begins, what are the circumstances under which FDA has found that safety substantiation dossiers don't satisfy the MoCRA requirement. And, obviously the enforcement that we may see of not having anything whatsoever will not prove particularly instructive, but it may be the most common enforcement case that we do see the agency pursue, because it's a slam dunk in so many words. But ultimately, as David mentioned, the statutory standard doesn't provide an awful lot to go on in terms of a checklist for specific types of data and studies. And FDA thus far in its public communications has said, well, you can look at the CIR review documents, and you can conduct certain toxicological testing, but and if you want a consultant, we can't refer you to one, but you should find one. So I think we'd like to see a lot more education as to what FDA believes is necessary to meet the reasonable certainty of non-injury standard in the law. But again, this shouldn't be for any manufacturer a case where they have to start from zero because they already had safety substantiation obligations for ingredients under regulations that have been in effect for decades now.
Yeah. One follow-up question, and that is for both of you. How will mandatory reporting of serious adverse events improve consumer safety? Will, let me start with you and then ask David the same question.
So having these serious adverse event reports come into the agency in a timely manner, as the law requires, will allow the agency to respond more quickly to safety signals in the marketplace, and combined with information that it has from, for example, product listing submissions should allow the agency to more effectively target its limited resources to address the safety signals. Just as these serious adverse event reporting requirements work across other FDA regulated areas. But again, if the agency doesn't have the resources internally to actually monitor these reports and associate data from them with data in the product listing database and actually pursue follow-up, a lot of it may prove illusory.
Yeah, I agree with Will on that. Don't have a lot to add. I think it's all going to come down to, obviously industry actually complying with it. So having a system to collect adverse events, having the ability to make the determinations internally, or using a third party consultant if it's a serious adverse event that requires reporting. And then, of course, to Will's point, will FDA have uh, the means to actually react to those submissions? So, yet to be seen. Obviously, it's kicked in just recently here, the requirement, at least on labeling, to have a way for consumers to know where to go to report an adverse event. And so I think there's still thousands of companies that haven't adopted that requirement yet on their labeling. We'll hopefully see more of them doing that. But that's the first step. And then there's the pieces behind it of having the ability to determine if you submit, and then FDA's got to do something with it.
Yeah, and David, I think on my end, I've been seeing companies that are concerned about how to demonstrate a linkage between their product causing a serious adverse event and there not being sort of a break um, in the user's experience, because there's obviously confounding variables, other products being used that could cause, right? And so I think that I'm curious to see how FDA will enforce and sort of kind of get a database of or enforcement reports on these to really understand how FD is going to enforce this and how companies as best practice should use that information to make these determinations, because that's kind of the critical issue for a
Yeah.
lot of companies.
And I think those companies, again, that are in the OTC field already, they've kind
Right.
of got a leg up on this. They understand how this works. But if you're a pure cosmetic brand owner, you're
Yeah.
not producing OTCs, this is new territory
Right.
for you.
Right. Yeah. Well, we're going to take a quick break right now, but don't go anywhere because we'll be right back.
We're back. We're talking about cosmetics regulation with Will Woodlee and David Lennarz. Shelly?
Thanks. Let's start with you, Will. As we all know, there has been a rising demand for ingredient transparency in cosmetics. Can you comment on how MoCRA's requirements intersect with the clean beauty movement, including any comments on the debate over controversial ingredients such as PFAS and parabens?
Thanks, Shelly. The law doesn't require that the industry disclose ingredients anew in a general matter. They were already subject to labeling requirements under provisions of the Food Drug Act and the Fair Packaging and Labeling Act implemented by FDA. And so I don't know to what extent these new requirements will provide new information to consumers who are interested in clean beauty products. But it may give consumers in this area additional confidence, rightly or wrongly, that these products are appropriately regulated and safe for their intended and labeled uses. et cetera, because FDA does have a whole lot more authority to ensure that products have adequate safety dossiers to support their existence on the U.S. market, and that the agency will respond to safety signals and would be more likely to have awareness of them, given some of the features of the law we've already talked about.
I want to ask one final question, first of David and then Will. Has to do with FDA resources. As we all know, FDA is chronically underfunded. Does the FDA really have the resources to enforce MoCRA? You've both raised the issue of enforcement. Does FDA really have the resources to do it? What industries or products are likely to face the most scrutiny, from an enforcement standpoint? And how can businesses prepare for potential FDA audits? I know that's a lot of questions, but let me turn it to our guests and get some views on that.
Happy to answer on that, Wayne. So I think when FDA has limited resources, which they do, they need to turn to systems that automate this process of identifying violative firms. And so, back to my comment earlier, as an example, if you want to enforce the registration and listing requirement of MoCRA very easily, not unlike pharma, devices, or food, you need to know who's shipping here to the US, what that product is that's coming in, and the easiest way to capture that is an automated system. Once you have that, right there, if you have that, you essentially close the door for non-compliant companies that products won't even get out of the port of entry. So in absence of that, that's a very easy way to enforce some key provisions of MoCRA. And then secondly, if you do have that, like the other commodities FDA regulates, you then know who's exporting, what the products are. You can see what their ingredients are. You know what ingredients or products are higher risk, and you can use your limited resources to target those products and those companies through inspections, either overseas or of products in the port of entry. So I fully agree, FDA is super constrained, we know, around their team in cosmetics in particular. But there are some simple things that could help enforce provisions of MoCRA that are not human capital intensive.
Will, any comments on that?
So the agency under MoCRA was appropriated funds to oversee cosmetics, and it ratcheted up to $42 million in fiscal 25, which started October 1 of 2024. But that was the cap. And, I'm not an economist or an accountant or really in a position to say that's enough or this much more is needed. But I can read the tea leaves a little bit and see the absence of at least a public administrative or enforcement action for noncompliance. I can see the dearth of education and for the most part guidance on compliance with these new requirements, and I can see the delays that we've experienced with FDA implementing this law. All of these things suggest to me that $42 million to regulate this industry with this host of new authorities isn't going to cut it. And while the agency knows how to make the most of the resources Congress gives it to get the biggest bang for its public health buck, It remains to be seen whether this is even close to enough to put the framework in place, let alone to police it adequately and deliver on the public health benefit potential that the legislature had in mind when enacting this.
Thank you. With that, we're going to shift gears a little bit. We're going to turn briefly to our resource link segment, where we provide you with some valuable links that you might want to check out. So, Shelly, let's share them with our audience right now.
Will do, but I want to first point out that these links will be included on our website, fdawatch.net, so there's no need to write anything down.
Right. So let's look first at our Pharma resource link. This is a link from STAT, the publication STAT, which is an online health and medicine publication platform that comments on FDA's new guidance on AI in drug development. The guidance is considered by some as FDA's attempt at creating regulatory clarity surrounding AI and comes as drug submissions citing AI continue to increase. A very important guidance issued just before the present administration took over. And as I mentioned earlier, AI is going to be a big issue for the incoming administration. Let's move on to medical devices. It's another link in the AI realm. It's a guidance from FDA that clarifies the terminology differences between FDA and the AI device manufacturers and software developers. For the purposes of regulation of safety and efficacy, the guidance offers recommendations on what information is needed throughout a product's life cycle. Again, a very important guidance. And as Shelly mentioned, this will be available on the link.
Moving on to our food resource link, it's the link to FDA's proposed requirement for the front of pack food nutrition labeling. If finalized, the label would provide readily visible information to consumers regarding 3 common nutrients directly linked with chronic diseases, which of course has been a policy concern for the agency when those nutrients are consumed in excess, so saturated fat, sodium, and added sugars. This aligns with FDA's nutrition priorities, which is again part of a government-wide effort to combat chronic diseases in the US. And finally, the cosmetics resource link. This is the link to a news report from Registrar Corp revealing that nearly half of cosmetic products sold at major US retailers remain non-compliant with FDA regulations under MoCRA, raising concerns as enforcement will continue to ramp up. And on that note, Wayne, it's time to thank Will Woodlee and David Lennarz for being really great guests in this episode. We'd also like to thank our podcast creator and executive producer, Michael Levin-Epstein, and our assistant producer, Sam Hoffmeister.
And Shelly, I want to repeat some things that we repeat at the end of all of our podcasts. If anyone wants to suggest or be a guest on our podcast, or wants to be a marketing partner or a sponsor, or just comment on the show, you can contact us at the following address: info, at fdawatch.net. I'm going to repeat, info at fdawatch.net. And definitely check out our website, which is fdawatch.net. And again, fdawatch.net. If you have not formally subscribed, please do so. You'll get notifications via email about our upcoming podcast. Finally, we'd appreciate it if you're so inclined to give us a 5-star rating on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcast. It really does make a difference. And I remind you, please do subscribe so that you get assurance that you won't miss a single episode of FDA Watch.
And as we say at the end of every episode of FDA Watch, if you really want to watch what FDA is doing, listen to FDA Watch.